Well, hello everyone. Um, this is always very awkward if you're presenting far away because I really wish I was with you. Um, but it was not possible for me to travel that far. And I'm so glad that I'm able to share in this situation. I can't see you, but I probably can hear you. So if I'm not clear or if suddenly the audio is not working, please speak up because all I can see are my slides on the screen. I also hope that the captions are on because I do speak quickly, but I only have the choice of doing this in English or Spanish, and my Spanish is not as good as my English. So thank you to everyone for inviting me. I wouldn't have had to write this, edit this book if I'd known about the network. But I hadn't, and I didn't know my colleagues in Brazil and in France, even those in California. So why I put together Beach Politics was because I've only done a small amount of research on beaches, but some, but it hasn't been my major focus. It's really been broader with public space. And I thought that the topic of beach and beach politics and the taking of beaches, which the very last presentation by Sandoval mentioned, what's going on in Malibu is what started my interest in this because I'm from LA and my mother sent me a clipping from what was happening in Malibu. And that's how I got started in this at all. But my idea was to gather as many public space individuals as I knew who also worked in beaches and put together a volume that was hopefully global in scope, just to flesh out what are some of the kinds of research being done and what are the kinds of issues that are coming up. I asked the authors, the contributors to the book, to address these four questions. And this is just a sense of where we started, which is under what circumstances does the enclosure of beaches occur, restricting access to what was once a commons? So we had a point of view. We were concerned about how access was restricted, and that's common in all the chapters. Then where and in what situations do these exclusionary strategies manifest? How is the denial of public rights justified and rationalized, both morally and legally? And what are the structures that enable the erasure of local claims to access and use? I must point out that for me, the third question was the most important. Just as in my research on gated communities, comunidades cerradas, which many of you are familiar with in Latin America, I was really wanted to understand how when beach access was taken away or restricted, how people explained it, how they rationalized it, well, how they legitimate it, because I felt like that was something that we could really engage in. Anyhow, the book itself came out, I guess about March or April, really quite quickly. It's divided into 4 sections along the idea of how it is that we get away with taking the beach. I hope you understand that. The first section is called Governing the Beach, the way that governance policies and protests use the beach, close the beach, privatize the beach. The second is shoring up the coastline, which is about protection and more of the ecological and hard structures, which so many of the presentations here today have already covered much better than we do. And I must not apologize, but this book is made up of mostly anthropologists, environmental psychologists, a couple of historians. I have a couple of urban planners and urban studies colleagues, but we're really a social science volume. So while we look at the loss of the coastline and sea level rise as critical, it's not the main focus. The third section of the book is on racializing the beach and inequality and erasure, and the fourth was on developing the beach. Again, we've talked about all of these topics today, and they resonate with all the talks I've heard. And in fact, I'm really hoping that maybe one of the outcomes of this conference would be to do another edited book, because I do think that the literature is thin, maybe not in articles and technical articles, but in terms of sort of comprehensive overviews that we could be using in our classes and more broadly in our universities. Now, what I was asked to do, and I'm going to try to do in the time I was given, is you asked me if I could provide a summary of all the conflicts that I found in the book. And then at the very end, also, what are the challenges that we face? And I think many of the presentations I've already heard have done a pretty good job of outlining the conflicts, and I'm not sure how much new I'm going to add, but maybe I can provide some depth or, expand the boundaries of how we're talking about things. Anyway, the conflicts that I found, and I have to say that I looked at the whole book, but I also used this as an exercise in AI, because I also asked ChatGPT, and I asked Claude, and I asked Perpetuity, and I asked Gemini. I asked every single one of them if they could look at the book and tell me what they thought all the conflicts were. And actually, there was a lot of agreement, but most of the AI programs could not read the entire book. So that was another interesting thing that I learned. Just in case you're interested in learning about AI, which I am. Anyhow, the first conflict that I'm not going to talk about in depth, because you've done a better job than I ever could, is public versus private ownership and access. That's the disputes over whether the beach is a common or private property that is being intensified by shifting coastlines and rising seas. In fact, I'm almost feeling after the presentation, I'm from LA. My house was burnt down in one of those LA fires that so devastated Malibu and where I used to live and all the hills of Santa Monica, that it finally came down to the coast. I feel like again that we're going to be using much more ecological and physical science resources rather than just the politics. On the other hand, they're building back just as they ever did. The second that I'm very interested in is how governance and law enforcement ambiguities are used to selectively favor elites, criminalize protest, and normalize exclusion while concealing illegal actions of those in power. You've mentioned that. I'm going to, again, I think it's in the United States at least, and especially the East Coast, the governance and law enforcement ambiguities are used to the extent to keep people out in all kinds of, I would say, illegal and illiberal ways. Economic commodification, third conflict, the transformation of beaches from spaces of use to shared enjoyment based on its increasing commodification. Fourth conflict, environmental protection versus development. Again, many of your presentations already discuss the conflicts between protecting natural coastal processes and stabilizing the land for settlement, but at the same time, what that does with climate change, intensifying the stakes. Racial and social exclusion, which you've all mentioned. I'm going to bring a case back from Brazil that I think is really important. Cultural memory and belonging has been mentioned here and there. I think it was, was it Charles Lester who spoke about indigenous claims to beaches? And I don't know if you all are aware that in the United States, after during Reconstruction, after the Civil War, that many African Americans moved to beaches because beaches weren't developed. These were lands that were very abandoned, and started farms and homesteads, as had indigenous peoples lived in these fragile coastal littoral areas. And so suddenly when the beach becomes valuable for real estate, their land claims were not secured. And as someone presented, I think it's Professor about Bruce's Beach, some of these claims are coming back, but cultural memory and belonging should remain as one of the major conflicts that we're facing. And then moral economies of exclusion, which, as I've mentioned, you've already had a wonderful paper on the moral economies of exclusion and how these justifications are reframed to make the beach exclusivity appear fair or natural or even beneficial. I won't be talking about that. I think the paper that was presented by Marina and Kai really already set the stage. So as I said, I'm going to try to go into depth on a few of these conflicts. And I hope that's what you thought I might do. I'm going to skip public and private ownership and access. I really think the presentations I've been able to hear, and I'm sure all of your discussions, have focused on this dimension. And instead, I will start with governance and law enforcement. And the example I want to use is drawn from chapter 1 in the book on beach privatization and social inequality in the US during the 20th century by Andrew Carl. And Andrew is one of our historians who has written books on the history of Black beaches and has taken upon himself to write a series of books particularly about race and beach exclusion historically. And he traces the transformation of the Connecticut shoreline from a public commons to a privatized landscape. And what I thought would be helpful, and I hope you find this helpful as well, is what I've done for each chapter. So this is chapter 1. I've gone through and I've pointed out how many conflicts are really discussed within one chapter. You know, we keep discussing, you asked me what kinds of conflicts we have, but within any one of these studies, within any one of these ethnographies, or this is a historical piece, there are multiple conflicts. And in fact, there are so many conflicts that the beach politics that I was talking about and that I was imagining that I would be able to flesh out is so complicated when you really look at each conflict individually. And that provides us with a kind of methodological problem, I think, when we start trying to look at the political dimensions of what we're looking at. So in Carl's case, he starts in the late 19th and 20th century. This is what drew me to his work, is that starting in the 1860s, private beach associations were formed. These are groups of people who bought a hunk of land together and were able to create a private association with a legal document that made the land, including the beach, completely private. It's the first occasion that we find this, at least in the United States, and the parties involved is it kept out all non-resident public, and it's a new legal, quasi-legal form, this beach association. And the charters of these beach associations excluded members from the beach, restricted who could buy the property, and extended that to access, travel, swimming, or relaxation. But of course, there were other dimensions and other conflicts going on at the same time. Prospective Blacks and Jewish buyers were not allowed to buy beach property or into these private beach associations by deed restriction. Deed restrictions explicitly in the United States forbade the sale of lots to Blacks or Jewish people. And so the owners of the lots were not only excluded just by the very legal governance, but that race was reimposed. I will say that in 1948 in the United States, these deed restrictions were challenged and in fact have forced people to create even more complicated ways of excluding all kinds of marginalized people because deed restrictions no longer functioned legally on property. A third conflict, as we've already seen, that emerges when deed restrictions and private beach associations were not adequate to keep out to keep out Black visitors. I think there's some misspelling in this slide, sorry. That when Black visitors did appear on the beach, as did Ann Petrie and a Sunday school group of Black children, they walked onto the beach in one case, others came by boat. Literally, guards removed the visitors from the beach, despite the public trust principles and despite the fact that it was illegal, just as you've seen the private guards telling people they can't be on the beach in Malibu, which is totally illegal. And then the fourth was that ultimately in Connecticut, though I need to explain that Connecticut is 95% of the beaches are private. Just here in New York, I think it's closer to 90. Someone was telling me that in Massachusetts, it's even higher than 95%. I don't know if someone in the audience knows if that's true. Some of the coastal management members, do you know if that's true? But the East Coast is much more privatized from California, which, as I say, is where I came from. So I was really shocked. But even when the Supreme Court of Connecticut ruled you couldn't bar access, new social controls emerged. So the Supreme Court and town and governments and the public seeking access still were in this incredible conflict because there were all kinds of unwritten rules that the towns could not, that were legally, it gets changed, but the social patterns and social relations were such that people still could not come in and because of the guards, because of all kinds of things. But even when the law and the governance strategies are seen to be illegal, that there is common interest law in Connecticut, still the common day practices, the use of parking lots and zoning and people not wearing the right clothes or people not being dressed in a certain way, all of these other kinds of more symbolic, one would argue, or soft measures are used. Okay, can someone tell me if this is making sense to you, since I can't see you, how I'm going through this? Yes. You're fine, you can hear me fine? Okay, because you're I can see you not at all. Okay, economic commodification. The conflict you've already brought up, the use value to exchange value. I think someone mentioned on the first day the post-political beach. Someone had read the article by Sabrine Kierbine and Charisse Christodoulou, but I did want to come back to this idea, whether this is theoretically really useful, but that another way that the beach, it isn't just that the beach gets commodified. We're more interested in this book on the ways that it gets commodified. And again, the strategies, the rationales, the legitimation. And this chapter 5 is really fascinating. These are colleagues of mine in Austria and Greece who are, again, public space scholars. And some of you may know Sabine, since she's very well known in Europe. That they're arguing that how beaches are becoming commodified is the beach politics are being removed. In other words, you can't see them. US scholars are not as comfortable with the term post-political as European scholars. I don't know that you as a group are particularly interested in our intellectual battles about this, but I think it's a really interesting idea that we think about how beach access moves from being a political problem or even a management problem to something that is a necessity. And this article traces that out. In the first conflict that they talk about, it's in Greece, it's in Thessaloniki, and it's between the municipal governments, private developers, and grassroots organizations who are fighting to keep their beach. And the municipal government and developers are frame the redevelopment project along the coast there to make it more accessible to tourists and for commodification. They frame it as a technical necessity. And by framing it as a technical necessity that, there's beach rights, we need to harden the beach, but it takes it away from the domain of political debate. And community concerns about access and affordability were completely dismissed or seen as emotional or uninformed. Again, something I think I wanted to highlight, that it's that with the technical necessity of erosion or whatever is going on and whatever the solution is, suddenly the demands of the public or their concerns become, it seems, less important discursively. Number two, conflict was privatization under the guise of modernization, which I don't think has come up, though I've not been in the whole conference. But here in Thessaloniki, this is still in Greece, the tourist investors and urban planners want to modernize the coast so they can get more, more tourists. And the residents who are reliant on informal traditional uses of the beach are in conflict with this. They can no longer stroll, fish, just like where I am right now in East Hampton, which is the east end of Long Island. They can't use the beach to gather seagrass or seaweed. They can't use the beach. They can't picnic because they want to change it, because it wants to be modernized. But Charisse argues in this that the narrative of modernization conceals the transfer of coastal resources to private control. What was presented as an improvement, though, reduced the public space. The third example in this chapter is by Sabine, and it's on Austrian lake beaches. One thing I said, a few things I didn't say about this book. We tried to be global, so we have nothing from Asia, unfortunately, and but we do have Australia, Africa, Europe, Middle East, and North and South America. But we also included some lake beaches and river beaches, because we were really interested, as I tried to say, the shoreline as the beach, as the zone. And what's happening in Austria, Austria has very strong laws that all beach is public, totally public. And the law that includes lake beaches. And yet, what's happening, as is happening, as you're saying in many places, people have summer homes that they build on the beach, and they are restricting access. And with this has come a lot of conflict and quite a bit of advocacy calling for greater public access. But interestingly enough, again, the official discourse portrays the lake beach. Okay. Kai, you just sent me something. Oh, a photo. All right, so I can see you. Hold on, I can't see it. Hold on, everyone. I'm going to look at you. See if I can see it. Ah, there you are. Okay. The official discourse is that that lake beaches are conflict-free spaces of leisure. And yet, as we all know, access was being limited by entry fees, zoning rules, and privatized facilities. So even though in a country and in the EU, where beaches are fully public, none of this high-mean water line that we go through in the United States, they were being, the discourse said that they were there, and yet they really weren't. So again, she's saying this becomes neutral, no politics. But more than that, there is this kind of silencing of political contestation in Austria. Sabine points out that the decision makers frame all kinds of beach policy in what she calls these post-political terms. And by that, she means policy language avoids terms like rights or justice, and any kind of environmentalist or marginalized users are portrayed as obstructing progress. Even more importantly, or at least from my point of view, so interesting, is in Austria, you're not allowed to buy essentially public land. Public land is owned by the government, as it is, I think, in many countries. However, they created a public-private governmental authority in which they were able to invest and put in the beach property, and then this agency, this commission, this authority was what we would call it in the United States, is able to actually sell public property and put it in private hands or to lease it. And she argues that by placing it into this new sort of quasi-governmental, quasi-privatized entity, you really completely go around the entire system of politics. And we see this with gating and other kinds of public space takings, at least in the United States and in Europe, time and time again. Environmental protection versus development, another conflict. We've been talking about that. You've given many, there have been a number of papers that have really talked about that, and I haven't been able to hear all of the discussion. I don't speak Portuguese, unfortunately. But it's kind of the core of the subject in many places, certainly the California shore, but here it's chapter 6. I'm going to talk about beachfront protection as beach privatization, and the authors here are Kirk Eisen and Anavia Consejo, who is a colleague who works with Kurt, who also, like so many of you, Kurt is he's a geographer, but a cultural geographer. I've written quite a bit with Kurt on social justice and public space. And Anna is, I believe, a geologist, but she's a hard scientist. And they've come together to look at June 2016, the severe storm on the Sydney coast. And one particular beach began to sort of dominate the news. And it's called, excuse my pronunciation, Collaroy Narrabee, and which was a highly capitalized beachfront with very expensive houses. And what they're pointing out in their chapter is that the conflict there is, again, property protection versus public access. Now, where I spend my summers is a place called East Hampton, and it's on Long Island. It's all beaches. Again, like I came from California, I feel more comfortable at the beach. So here I am on Long Island. But we run into this problem in Montauk, and that storms come along. In fact, we're in the middle of a storm right now. It's completely swallowing up our beaches. People, coastal homeowners, this is in Sydney and here, have $40 million homes here in East Hampton, and the beachgoers and community members and local councils still want to be able to use the beach. And what starts happening is, as you all well know and have already talked about, the erection of seawalls and rock barriers to shield the private homes have the practical effect in Sydney of narrowing, in some cases, eliminating the public beaches. And this is what's happening right in my backyard and is happening in Sydney. And residents, those with the houses, justify their actions in the language of property rights, while critics point to the erosion of collective coastal commons. And I want to add just a personal note here. Here on conflict too, there's the engineering solutions versus ecological warnings. Government agencies and coastal scientists and geomorphologists come in and argue about how these beaches should be kept. And the geomorphologists tell us that beach walls accelerate erosion along the shore, which means taking whatever public beach is near where these private houses are. And yet, despite these warnings, local authority often frame engineering as the only practical adaptation to climate change. And here in Montauk, I've never been sympathetic to this. I think that the $40 million houses should go, and I've not been sympathetic. However, I spend a lot of time in Montauk, which is a beach town, and there's a lighthouse there, and it's a national park that I studied, actually. There are a lot of national and state parks in this region, protecting some of the coastal land. And the Army Corps of Engineers right now are building seawalls to protect maybe $30,000 homes in Montauk to protect the home, but they're also protecting the beaches, and they're dredging sand. And they're now doing it every 2 months. It takes, that's how fast the sand is going. And I find this outrageous. And yet when I go to town hall meetings, which I do, the people in Montauk point out that the entire town of Montauk, the entire economy is supported by tourism. If they don't have beaches and they don't have tourists, the entire town and every business in it will die. It was traditionally a fishing town, but fishing no longer really supports it. And in fact, it was failing and a lot of other issues. So I guess have to think twice that the taxes that bolster Montauk are also from those 40 million and $30 million houses. So I know I'm talking about Sydney, but I'm just I bring it home because I think I want to say that something that I thought was really simple to solve when I think of the entire community of Montauk not having any way to make any kind of living, including the fishermen. I don't know, it gives me pause. Anyhow, in Sydney, there is always this kind of pressure between development and environmental activism. Activists mobilized around Save Our Sand, framing seawalls as theft from the future generations, while councilors argued they were balancing economic growth with adaptation. And community members see this as a smokescreen for privatization in Sydney. But as I just told you in my little side story about Montauk, I think it's really complicated. It's more complicated than I had felt because, again, the thought of losing an entire town to me was sobering, and all the people who live there. So it becomes to me less about just saving the wealthy homes, but possibly saving an entire economy and region. Maybe you have explicitly talked about racial and social exclusion of beaches, but of course in a book that's written by anthropologists and geographers, primarily and environmental psychologists, and heavily, at least 5 of the cases are in the United States. Racial and social exclusion is another component of the kinds of conflicts that we see. And the ones that I think we can address, what are some of them? And I wanted to quickly mention chapter 12, which is by Keisha Khan Perry. I don't know if any of you are familiar with Keisha Khan's work in Brazil. And she wrote a chapter on what she calls a coveted paradise. And in her chapter, she talks about the much more explicitly than many of the other chapters about development and tourism versus Black coastal communities. And would somebody please correct my pronunciation of the town? Gamboa de Bao, is that correct?
De Baixo.
Yes.
De Baixo. Gamboa de Baixo.
Gamboa, yes.
Okay, it's the best I can do. But it's in Bahia, and you'll be going there, right? Nearby to a beach? No.
No, it's far away from here.
It's far. Okay. Anyway, it's a very, as I understand it, when she started working there, it's a very small fishing town full of Black coastal communities and urban developers and tourists and yacht clubs and luxury apartment developers have come in and are literally pushing the residents off the land, even though they've lived there again for generations. But again, just as in Florida, in the U.S. examples that Andrew Carl talks about, and the loss of southern beaches, the claims to lands are not necessarily quote as legal, at least legal enough to fight the developers and yacht clubs. And Gamboa is the face of Bahia. They argue that it's not a place for poor Black people to live. This is from Keisha Khan's research. The beach they played on, the residents played on after school and work, the waters that provided food for their families and spiritual rejuvenation were destined for tourism and luxury real estate development, not for poor Black people to live next to and enjoy. At least that was the official discourse of the developers and tourist authorities. And in this case, and we haven't talked too much about militarized policing, she recounts when the Bahian state military police came in and pushed residents and youth and the women activists off during an early morning invasion of this beach town. With town, it looks like the state military police executed 3 young people. I'm not going to try to pronounce their names. And the neighborhood argued, somos gente is how you say it in Spanish. They say we are people, and yet they're being treated. They're being literally, the military is being brought in to police and push the people out so that the tourists and luxury condos can go up. So of course we have elite coastal infrastructure in conflict with ecology and public access. Here, the conflict that she's talking about is much more between the yacht clubs and the port cruise interests, and the city and the port authorities and the residents and coastal residents. In fact, I wanted to bring up one of the chapters I'm not going to have time to talk about is in Beirut. And that is, again, one of the conflicts that beaches are also places for these large yachts and cruises, and are really deforming beach areas and creating, again, eradicating the public beach in Beirut. The only public beach left is the one where all the sewage is dumped, and everything else has been hardened or privatized in such a way that cruises can visit. But here she's talking about this elite coastal infrastructure also creates much more man-made or human-made destruction by these artificial barrier reefs for the yacht clubs, or the removal of sand to make space for massive cruise and cargo ships. And it makes it impossible for fishermen to make a living and coastal residents to use what remaining beach is there. And again, I don't know if we've had a chance to talk about this kind of about yacht clubs and cruise interests. I think it's worthwhile putting that on our list. And finally, the evictions. I wasn't there again, where in her chapter, people are displaced. They literally push the residents out and push them into areas where they can't make a living. So again, the parties involved, the conflict is between the city-state planners, displaced residents, and these peri-urban communities and activists. So in the 1990s, the Sikh community, I'm not going to put it, the Sikh was located on another beach, and it was forcibly moved to a distant periphery of Salvador, so that Black people are forced to live farther and farther away from the coast. Cultural belonging and memory. I really feeling that this was mentioned over and over again, that the narratives that people have, I have to shut my door just a moment. The narratives that people have about belonging are so incredibly important. Place attachment to beaches is some of the strongest attachment that I've ever studied. But I don't know that I have time really to go through another case, but let me at least just mention chapter 13, which is about the struggle for Puerto Rico's coast, which is really classic by Catherine McCaffrey, who is also an anthropologist, as is Keisha Khan, an anthropologist, as is Maria Perlman, which I'm not, Mariano, paper you've already heard. Here we're talking about Puerto Rico's historic communal use of the coast, constantly confronting modern privatization, from the beach called Carolina to Old San Juan to Rincon. And what McCaffrey has done is taken both the historical view of communal use of the beach and how it's been commodified. She argues that it got commodified because beach was seen as empty space, you know, an empty space of leisure. That neutral language, remember, that Sabine is talking about as sort of post-political, that erases diverse and productive realities of the shore. And as common property, the Puerto Rican coast was historically provided access to natural resources, and it wasn't owned or managed by external agents. But over time, in fact, agents have come in. And what her chapter is about, and I would be really great to spend more time talking about, is all the fighting that has occurred, and that some of, like this Amigas del Mar and Tio Kayak are direct action groups. Tio Kayak is a person who is very well known. That they've been fighting Marriott International, and actually, in some ways, got some concessions. They are actually fighting for a more ecological littoral coast, which didn't actually happen in Carolina, but in the Isleta de San Juan, they wanted to put this huge shopping mall, this Paseo Caribe. Again, there was a criminalization of the activists went on the construction site with a kayak, and this Tito Kayak, it's not his real name, and he went down the crane and stopped all construction on this Paseo Caribe. It's kind of a mall that they were creating at the beach. But the courts then created a law that said you couldn't, in fact, disturb a building on a site. That's the ley Tito Kayak. And this is about an underground parking that they wanted put in that would to build a swimming pool that would again convert a public park into a parking lot, and they were able to win. So I guess I want one other part of the book that I'd love us to spend more time focusing on is how local communities have won on some of these conflicts, on some of these disputes. But overall, we're still facing a lot. All right, this is about a hawk bill that they use to confront a pool. I'm not going to talk about moral economy's exclusion. I already wrote, Kai and Mariano already presented, and this would have been the chapter that I would have brought up, in that these different moral economy is really important, but I think it's been said better than I can in a very brief overview, and let me just conclude. I hope this has been helpful and that you've been able to take something. I know it's kind of a broad brush stroke, but that's what I was asked to do, and I hope it's been helpful for tying up the end. And you asked me what are the overall challenges that you would take away from the book as a whole, because as I said, I did the book, and I did because I felt like I didn't have enough material, I didn't have enough data, I didn't have enough case stories from a number of different places to really know if what I was seeing here on my local beaches and the kinds of problems that I was facing, whether or not they were specific to the East Coast of the Northeast of the United States, because it's very different in California, or whether these were broader things. So here are the challenges that we're facing, and this is not even including the fires and the I'm not even looking at the ecological pressures that we're going to lose all our beaches. These are things that a social scientist would point to that we want to continue to work on, and that I think we can work on. One is stopping the restriction of public access. That it's an ongoing trend to limit access. This is something that we can work on, that I think is within our power, at least at this moment in time. Number two, socio-racial restructuring. Maybe this isn't happening everywhere, but in most cases, coastal engineering, gentrification, development deepen the inequalities that are already there. And I think we'll agree, if they reshape social relations, they racialize the space, or if you prefer not to use US type language, they make it more exclusionary and they deepen inequalities. We can, as social scientists, at least on my side, work on this. Moral economies of exclusion. I think the paper was really excellent. We need to understand that there are different moral economies that normalize and justify beach exclusivity, and we need to make exclusion not appear so acceptable or beneficial. The erosion of collective memory, the repression or erasure of local histories. That's true in the South in the United States, for indigenous people in the United States, but many other kinds of community collective memory that should be bolstering claims to use of beach resources. Legal and political manipulation, as I said, this is probably the part I'll work on the most. I find the way that authorities and elites use legal loopholes or even just illegal actions outrageous. They do the same thing. The same people who live in Malibu happen to live in a place called Georgica Beach here in East Hampton, and they use the same techniques that they use in Malibu. I find that just incredible. The environmental pressures we've talked about. Don't have the expertise to do much about it, but I think we need to think about the environmental pressures as putting a vice on this. The commodification of the commons, which is happening faster and faster and faster as they increase in value, and the common realm has less and less money to protect it, or as in Austria, decides not to. And finally, government gaps and power imbalances, that local governments often lack the resources or political will to manage coastal hazards equitably. I think that Sandoval, I can't remember, said something about, what is it? Politics as usual. People are building back. Nothing much has changed. Excuse me, Mario Sandoval. Nothing much has changed. And finally, theoretical contributions. I feel like I'm out of time, so I'm not. For those of us who are anthropologists in the group, I did walk away with some theoretical contributions to the social science literature, which is another way to look at our beach research. What do we have to contribute to the overall conversation? Again, I'd like to hear from you. Do you want me to talk about theoretical contributions, or should I just stop because of time?
No, you can go on.
Go on.
Yeah, please. Yeah.
All right, it's my last slide. Beaches are an incredibly important contact zone. And I'm hoping that we bring more and more attention to studying them, because it is where social, racial, and environmental inequalities are enacted and contested. Just like I argued back in 2000 that plazas were places where a microcosm, say in San Jose and in Costa Rica, the plaza and all the conflicts within it and the people there really reflected so many of the cultural and social and economic issues that were going on in all of Costa Rica. Not, that the center often reflects the edges, or in some cases. In this case, the edge reflects the center. By studying beaches, I think we get a really incredible bird's eye view, a microcosm of what is going on elsewhere that is so clear and so radical and so graphic that I think it gets people to stop and really think about what is going on in our world today, be it environmental or social and racial. Another theoretical piece is the thing about beaches as it gets publicized. Mariano actually talks about, did you talk about, Mariano, that something that happens on the beach, a conflict, gets reverberated out to the media and it becomes a kind of national problem? Did you talk about that? Like, what did you use the word, a megaphone?
Didn't talk about that.
You didn't talk about that. Anyhow, in Mariano's chapter, he talks about how, all right, so say Malibu. I mean, we all read about Bruce's Beach in the United States, New York Times headline about the Malibu access. Okay, so here's something, and it gets publication in the sense of it brings attention to struggles about injustice, and that can be very useful for us and should be utilized. We also found theoretically that discursive strategies, the ways in which things are talked about, can restrict access and are used to neutralize that post-political but they can also create solidarities. So discursive analysis of beach activities, I think, is incredibly important going forward. We learned about new financial and planning instruments. I mean, I learned about these private beach associations that were started in the 1860s that now are illegal, but they're the forerunner of gated communities. And nobody even writes about them because beaches aren't studied very often as social ecological spaces. But there are new financial and planning instruments, notions of modernization and progress and tourism that allow the beach to be incorporated in the private sector outside of any political process. For me, that is the post-political. That racial and social erasure, that the erasing of the histories of beaches reinscribes, at least again now in U.S. jargon, white colonial and private property logic on what was once a commons. One of the things that I intend to write about more, I hope, is that in the United States, private property rights are very, very, very strong. They are not as strong, say, in Mexico. The talk on Mexico, right? I think you're probably doing better, and yet you have what's going on in the Yucatan with my colleague Matilde Cordova. If you don't know her work, Stuck on Tourism, about the Yucatan, it's worth taking a look. But at least in the U.S., the commons, whatever once was a commons, has been erased by private property law and sort of settler colonialism. Many of you know, beaches do give us a kind of different view of how that logic gets transformed. And I started to explain that it's very hard to have collective common rights in a society that so highly prioritizes private property. And then something you all know about, I learned a lot about tourism and urban development that targets public access through commodification and privatization. I walked away from the book theoretically understanding that just tourism and any kind of urban development immediately commodifies whatever public space is involved and privatizes. And that, knowing that ahead of time, knowing that as a theoretical construct or as a question going in, I think speeds up the process of what we can do. So thank you.